Okay, hi, how are you doing, everybody? It's really brilliant to be here with you this evening for what is our first ever Solas webinar. And we know that people are joining us from all around the UK, indeed all around the world, people tuning in on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, Instagram. Brilliant to have you all with us. Solas, this for us is new ground, new territory, and we're fascinated to see how it goes. But we do pray that tonight will be inspiring and encouraging for you. And tonight's webinar, our first one, is entitled Viral Evangelism, Sharing Your Faith in a Locked Down World. I'm Gavin and I'm in Perth in Scotland, not the Australian Perth, the Perth in Scotland. Andy Bannister, the director of Solas, is behind his laptop in Dundee. And joining us from Belfast is Gareth Black, the latest member of the Solas team. I'm going to kind of steer the conversation through this evening and bring them in at various points to bring their expertise and their wisdom around this whole topic. But because I'm sort of steering the conversation, I also need to bring you a couple of necessary announcements, the kind of the boring housekeeping bit at the beginning that we need to do to make sure that the rest of this evening runs smoothly. And the first thing to say is this, that Andy and Gareth are going to set the conversation going, but then we'd love you to be involved after that. So we're going to have Q&A in the second part of this evening. And that'll involve you sending in your questions for Gareth and Andy so that you can shape the second half of the conversation around where these issues relate to you, your questions, and your situation. Up on the screen, you should be able to see a link to the website that is going to do that for us. Please don't put your comments and questions into the channel you're viewing it on. If you put your questions into Facebook or Twitter, we won't see them. We're going to do them all through Pigeonhole. So if you have got a web browser there, go to pigeonhole.at. And if you type in the box there, Solas webinar, one word, all caps, that will bring you through when you put in your name and register there into just our bit where we will see all the questions. And that means we can group together all the questions from, all the different channels, YouTube and Twitter, and we'll see them all. So please don't put your questions into the format you're watching because we won't see them there. If you didn't get that, pigeonhole.at, it will come up again later on. There'll be plenty of chances again to fire your questions in there so that you can be involved in steering the second half of this evening's webinar. The second thing is, I suppose, more pastoral than practical. And that's just to say this, we're very aware that the context that we're talking about evangelism this evening is of what's going on in the world at the moment, and that may be affecting you personally. And we don't want to kind of rush in a kind of an unseemly way into the church's business, because although the church still has business in sharing the message of Christ, it's not business as usual. We are aware, in fact, some of the struggles and suffering that's going on around us at the moment has impacted several members of the Solas team and the Solas family in terms of sort of isolation or family struggles or financial struggles. So we understand that although we're doing God's work in this particular context. So before we rush into the practicalities, I want to tell you that the way that we help each other at Solas through these difficult times is by praying for each other in our morning meetings. Now, if these are things that you're grappling with too, we'd love to extend the invitation that we could pray for you too. Before we rush on to business, we do want to say to you that if you are struggling with all these issues that the world is grappling with at the moment, if you send us an email through the Solas website, it's at solas-cpc.org, and go to the connect button, send that in there. It'll be very confidential, but I promise I'll read your prayer request out in our morning prayer meeting, and we will pray for you and the different struggles and the difficulties that we're all facing at the moment, because we're doing God's work, but we're doing it in this particular context. So those are my two kind of announcements to start with, one practical, one pastoral. So now we're going to bring Andy Bannister into the conversation to really start off our discussion this evening about sharing the gospel under lockdown. I expect many of you are well aware of who Andy is because you've sort of dialed into a Solas webinar. Andy is the director of Solas here. I have to say nice things about me. He's my boss. So tell you just a couple of things. Andy's academic background is in Islamic studies. He's a very well-known author and speaker all around the world who is very involved in promoting and defending the Christian faith. And now we're doing it under lockdown. So Andy, could you start our conversation off this evening? Maybe open up some of the ground in terms of the challenges and opportunities that the current circumstances are presenting us in the church. Andy.
Well, thank you, Gavin, and good evening to all of you watching on the live stream or watching and catch up later. And This is a fascinating time to be alive. Many of us are, struggling personally, have found our own lives restricted in different ways. And of course, that affects, how we go about our lives as Christians. And, evangelism can be tough at the best of times. It can be tough at the best of times. But now, as we are living in an age of coronavirus, it can certainly be even tougher. Many of us, and I'm conscious that maybe people watching from other kind of countries and contexts, but many of us watching this are living with lockdowns and restrictions on our movement. Of course, the experts hope this will prevent COVID-19 from spreading. I think many in the church are perhaps nervous it will keep the gospel from spreading. And of course, there are temptations too that come in this age of coronavirus. There can be a temptation sometimes, perhaps, for evangelism to drop down the priority list for local churches. It can be sort of tempting, perhaps, for churches to devote most of their energy to running effective Zoom meetings, making sure that people don't turn up, wearing inappropriate pajamas at Zoom Bible studies. Or churches can spend all of their time kind of figuring out, how it is, we can do a kind of effective Zoom meetings and all this other kind of stuff. In other words, all of our life can go into looking internally and inwardly, focusing on our own needs rather than focusing externally, figuring out how to keep our own structures going. But of course, one of the things I'm slightly nervous about is if we focus all of our energy inward, do we risk forgetting perhaps a little bit at times that the gospel imperative is outward? But despite those challenges of being restricted by lockdown, and perhaps being tempted to focus inward rather than outward, there are incredible opportunities right now for evangelism. For example, a lot of people are dipping into online services and Christian activities online. So recently, the Guardian newspaper, by no means a friend usually of Christians and the church, ran a fascinating report the other week reporting that 25% of adults in the UK have watched or listened to a religious event. That's 1 in 4, that's staggering. But get this, that rises to 1 in 3 people when we come to the 18 to 34 age group. That's simply staggering. Spiritual questions are also popping up in often quite unusual places. So, for example, the comedian Russell Brand, an interesting and curious character, but one with a huge following, recently posted a video to his social media exploring the question why so many people are Googling how to pray. Almost 500,000 people have watched or engaged with that video. And he then went on to actually do a debate with another fellow comedian and atheist, Ricky Gervais, on the whole question of atheism and belief in God. The trailer for their conversation alone garnered 2 million views at the point that I'm speaking to you. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not sort of over-egging this. I'm not trying to claim that, hey, it's amazing, Russell Brand has found Christ. But I am intrigued that people like him are thinking seriously about God and faith and spiritual questions in a way they haven't been before. And if you look at the comments and the shares on his post, it's interesting he's not alone. Thousands and thousands of other people are too. In other words, there's a conversation going on, and that's an opportunity. There's also an opportunity in that I think coronavirus has exposed the kind of deeply Christian roots of our culture in surprising ways. So, for example, here in the UK, the app that is used by our National Health Service to manage volunteers is, lo and behold, wait for it, it is the Good Sam app. Where did that name come from, I wonder? We've also seen celebrity culture, which is always a little bit toxic, wither, and I think real, genuine heroes get celebrated. Here in the UK, Captain Tom Moore, who just turned 100 years old, raised millions of pounds for charity, walking round and round his garden. And it's interesting to see the attention a story like that is getting. And then at the same time, lots of journalists are writing stories about how coronavirus has shown how many of the things we build our lives on, our jobs, security, health, and convenience, have all been found wanting. In other words, I think there are some incredible opportunities for the gospel. Yes, we live in difficult times, but there are also evangelistic opportunities to be grasped. Yet sometimes I think maybe we overlook or even avoid those opportunities because of a problem that isn't directly related to coronavirus. And that's namely the fact that many of us are, at times, if we are honest with ourselves, maybe just a little bit fearful at the thought of evangelism. And maybe let's be honest, coronavirus has made it very easy to say, hey, I'd love to go out and do some evangelism, but I can't. The government won't let me. Fear holds many of us back at times from sharing the good news of Jesus with friends and neighbours and colleagues and family.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy, for kind of opening up the territory. So days of challenge and also days of opportunity. Now, my observation is that most Christians think that evangelism is great as long as somebody else is doing it. And it's sort of, here am I, Lord, send him kind of attitude. Now, I don't know what you think, but my desire is honestly to talk to people about Jesus, but I find it really, really difficult. And I know I'm not alone in that. You talk to so many Christians and they say, I love my friends and I love Jesus, but talking to them about him is ever so hard. Gareth, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now to draw on some of your insights. Why do you think we find it so hard to talk about things that matter so much to us? What holds us back? Why are we so afraid of evangelism?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin, and hello to everybody watching. I think you struck on one of the biggest obstacles. Of course, fear isn't the only obstacle that many people have to evangelism, but it's certainly one of the most common ones. And I think it's fair to say that that's nothing new. The best and most experienced evangelists in the world all struggle with fear at times. In fact, I find it quite telling that the Apostle Peter, when he wrote that famous verse to always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope within you, he actually begins by saying, do not be afraid of other people and don't be troubled. And I personally find that very encouraging, because it tells me that the Bible understands that one of the biggest obstacles that we often have in doing evangelism is fear and sometimes shame as well. And Peter certainly knew that, and the Lord used him. There's a whole host of reasons why I think we might be afraid. Let me just give you a few. The first is just that very natural fear of rejection by people that we value. I think all of us want to be valued and respected by friends and by colleagues. And so we often avoid engaging with them on any kind of topic that might reveal uncommon ground or disagreement. And that's not specific to religion. That could be politics or anything else. And I guess added to that then in the context of religion, within the wider sort of social and professional world, we're all, I think, as Christians under increasing pressure to be silent about our faith. There is a very prevalent impression, I think, in culture today when it comes to Christianity that it's simply a private thing at best, and it's not for the public sphere. And at worst, it's an outdated thing, if not even a dangerous thing, and we need to sort of relegate it to a bygone era if we're going to be on the so-called right side of history. Now, of course, none of these challenges when we look at the Bible are particularly new, but they do have an effect, and they can intimidate us into, albeit vetoing the mandate that Jesus gave us to be salt and light. And that's important. I guess another reason why we might be nervous is beyond what other people make of our sharing the gospel, we may just feel like we don't have what it takes. We don't have the answers. We're scared of being confronted with questions and maybe propositions that people might make that we just can't have an answer to, and we just haven't thought about. I remember when I started to do evangelism among students, I was terrified because I was just assuming that every student that I came across was the next Richard Dawkins or the next Christopher Hitchens, and they would confront me with something that I just didn't have a clue how to answer. And unfortunately, I think sometimes even in the church, we haven't sort of mitigated that sense of inadequacy very well, because evangelism and particularly apologetics is often sort of displayed as a very specialized subject for professionals. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth when we look at the New Testament. But some of us feel that, we need to be an expert before we even get started. And of course, if that's our criterion, then we're never going to get started at all. But there are some things that we can do to sort of mitigate that sense of inadequacy, and maybe we can think about what people's questions in our circle of influence might be, and just have a think about what those questions might be and how we might answer them, so that at the very least, whatever response we might have, at least when we might be confronted with it, and we're not hearing that question or having to think about that question for the very first time. I think a lot of us find ourselves in that boat. And of course, that's not a problem with culture. That's not a problem with the person asking the question. That's a problem with us, that we haven't necessarily taken it seriously to think ahead of time, what people's questions might be, so that we're ready for them. I find it very interesting that the word that Peter uses again in 1 Peter 3 for be ready is the same words that is used in the Gospels when Jesus says, be ready, for the Son of Man comes at a day and hour that you don't know. Well, so do questions come at a day and hour when you don't know. Often people ask questions at the most inconvenient time and not when you're expecting them. And that's why we have to be sort of continually ready ahead of time. And so there are other reasons, I guess, as well, beyond just our sense of inadequacy. Sometimes it's a bad experience that we've had, we've tried it and it's failed. Or here's a final one. Sometimes I find that people say to me, if I open up my faith to the questions and to the scrutiny of people who don't believe or might have big objections to taking God seriously, what happens if they say something that's very persuasive and I lose my own faith in opening it up? And of course, because that's deeply meaningful to us, we don't want to do it. So we sort of keep our faith below the parapet, lest if we sort of stick it up, it gets shot to pieces. So there's a few reasons.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. That's really helpful. You're actually addressing several of the fears that I have. In doing what I know is right can sometimes be really quite difficult. And I'm going to put my hand up and admit that several of the fears and things that you've talked about there, they're mine. And I assume that I'm not alone, and that many people watching this are going to be in exactly the same situation. They want to do the right thing, they find it fearful. Could you give us maybe a few practical intros of where maybe someone who wants to take the first few steps in taking the gospel out, or maybe becoming known as a Christian if they're hiding at work or at school or whatever, how can they take the first steps into just being a little bit more faithful tomorrow than they were yesterday, maybe?
Yeah. And
then could you hand over to Andy? And Andy, could you get ready to come in on the back of Gareth once you've chucked in a couple of things there, Gareth? Thank you.
Certainly. Well, perhaps I'll just start with two things that are sort of integral to evangelism in any context. I know we're thinking about a lockdown context, but that doesn't excuse stuff that's sort of integral to the broader context. The first thing that I would encourage is prayer. Now, that might seem a little simplistic, spiritual, not practical, but it's really not. We need to remember that evangelism is not simply about what happens in the immediate moments of a conversation with a non-Christian. So much of effective evangelism is about what happens before, the preparing ourselves. And one of the best ways, I think, to prepare ourselves is to be deeply committed to prayer. I'm reminded of that famous quote by E.M. Bounds on prayer: no learning can make up for the failure to prayer. No earnestness, no diligence, no study, no gifts supply its lacks. Talking to people about God is a great thing, but talking to God about people is greater still. So start with prayer. I think we need to remember that God is more invested in bringing people to himself than we could ever be. And prayer helps to remind us that we're not on our own. This is not a solo task. And I would just say, when you pray, be specific. Mention people by name to the Lord. Tell the Lord your fears and concerns. If perhaps you're going to be Zooming with someone later in the day, or perhaps meeting with them in some kind of context, ask the Lord, are there specific topics or questions that you want me to address? Are there specific verses that maybe I should float into the conversation? Invite the Holy Spirit, who is, after all, the world's best evangelist. Invite the Holy Spirit to lead you very specifically and help you perhaps overcome that spirit of fear with a spirit of power and love and self-control. And even when I'm in conversations with people, I'm often praying, internally, just asking the Lord, help me to see what's really going on here. Give me insight that only you can give. I think God delights to answer those kinds of prayers. And the more that I pray about these things, the more these opportunities seem to come. It's a bit of a divine coincidence. And yet, when those opportunities do come, I also think that because I've been invested praying beforehand, I'm way more likely to take the opportunity. If I haven't been praying, if I haven't been thinking about it and the opportunity presents itself, I think I'm probably less likely to go for it if I've been really praying about it. And the other thing with prayer, I think that's just finally worth saying, is that prayer is not just something for you, but it's also something that you can offer other people. I know many of us have, I'm sure by now, heard the news of the death of Ravi Zacharias yesterday, and what a great evangelist Ravi was. I can remember meeting Ravi for the first time some years ago, and I'll never forget what he shared with me. He gave us advice on doing evangelism, and his best piece of advice was this. He said, offering prayer is a tremendous apologetic. And that stuck with me, I think, because here's a guy who has a tremendous ministry, can tackle people, the best of them philosophically, and engages with all sorts of people. And yet his advice was offering to pray for people is tremendously effective as a Christian apologetic. And as Andy has said already, we're living in a time when many people are open to prayer. Many people are Googling prayer and engaged with prayer. And so some people, rather than being offended, will actually be flattered and will be deeply encouraged that you offer to pray for them. I had an experience just last month when I was talking with one of my supervisors from university in London, and she's sort of in lockdown on her own in a flat in London. We've been talking about coronavirus, and I just decided to write to her and said, look, at these times my faith's very meaningful to me. And particularly prayer. Would you mind if I pray for you? Is there anything that I could pray for you? And she wrote back, she's not a believer in God, but she said, thank you, that means so much to me. I would really appreciate that, because if you're going to get into a conversation with people and they're going to share about experiences in their lives that are perhaps tough, even if they don't believe in the one that you're praying to, it can still be hugely meaningful for people to know that you've listened enough, you've understood what they're saying enough, and you care about it enough to actually pray. So that's one thing. Very quickly, the second thing would just be to think about the art of conversation. Now, again, this sounds pretty basic, but I think one of the best starting points for evangelism is to think about just how good an evangelist am I? How good a conversationalist am I? Because there's a big difference. Most of us assume that we're very good as a conversationalist because we know how to talk to our friends and to our family very easily. But there's a big difference between talking to family members and friends that we converse with every day and talking to strangers or neighbours that we don't know so well, and kind of trying to lead the conversation beyond small talk to those more meaningful things about hopes and fears and values and things like that. So I would just encourage us to think about how good a conversationalist am I actually? And I would invite you to get somebody else to answer that question. If you're like me, I often give myself the benefit of the doubt. But it's going to be impossible to do effective evangelism with people if you aren't really good at engaging with them. Many people in the gospel who followed Jesus followed him off the back of a conversation. Jesus was a great conversationalist. And our conversations don't explicitly have to be about God. I think one of the reasons why we struggle with evangelistic conversations is that we know we're going into the conversation to do evangelism. And it can seem like a huge jump from small talk to God talk. And it is in many ways. So I would just encourage us to take small steps in good conversation. Aim at good conversation, being the kind of person that somebody likes to talk to and comes away having enjoyed the conversation. But over the course of that conversation, or maybe over the course of multiple conversations, try to learn to move to more meaningful things, perhaps people's own thoughts and experiences, and then move it to the God conversation. It's a much more organic and natural leap from small talk to sort of good conversation, to more meaningful conversation, to then God conversation. So, of course, the best thing to do in conversation, I think, is not just to be a good conversationalist, but to learn how to ask good questions rather than to sort of make propositions. But I'm sure Andy will say something about that because he's more of an expert on good questions than I am.
That was some really helpful stuff there, Gareth. Thanks for kind of sharing that. And yeah, let me just kind of pick up the baton there and really sort of unpack for us a little bit how we can have these kind of the natural conversations about faith with our friends and our neighbours and our colleagues, like Gareth was suggesting there. And I think, you know, as you hinted at the end there, Gareth, by far one of the best ways to do that is to learn the art of good questions. And, you know, it's interesting how much we sometimes miss the fact that Jesus was a master question asker. We think of him as a master teacher and a great storyteller and all the other things he did. But if you read the Gospels, he asked over 300 questions in the Gospels and uses questions brilliantly in terms of engaging people, drawing them out, responding to challenges, and so on and so forth. And so I guess one of my sort of questions and thoughts is how in our conversations with our friends and our neighbours over the back fence, perhaps in online Zoom meetings, maybe with the people that we bump into or are out there doing our physically distanced exercising, how can we find ways to kind of weave questions naturally into our conversations? And in fact, an obvious starter, actually, coronavirus in one sense makes it easier, because a very obvious question starter, I find, is to ask people, you know, how are you? And here in Scotland, in the wider UK, a very British response is to not go particularly deep. But I think coronavirus actually offers us an opportunity to go that little bit deeper and say to people, you know, how are you really doing? And how's your family doing? How are you coping? Is everything okay? And at the same time, as you engage in that conversation, be honest about your own situation, be even vulnerable yourself, share where you're struggling, share where you're finding it hard. You know, honesty and transparency build connections too. And as you ask questions and interact, develop a conversation, you know, a very natural bridge, I find, into things of the gospel. Gareth shared one there just there with prayer, but I find a very natural way in is the whole question of hope. And to say to somebody, you know, how do you find hope? How do you personally find hope given all that's happening? And remember, when we ask those questions, we're not just playing games. We want to genuinely listen to what our friends say. You know, listen carefully, ask follow-up questions, be praying quietly that the Lord, that the Holy Spirit would prompt you as to what you can say in return. And then as a Christian, you know, find the opportunity to say, look, as a Christian, this is where my hope lies. And I find hope is a really good way to introduce. I like introducing questions about hope into the conversation. Is one of the things I've noticed that can be really powerful in the times that we live in right now, is to find ways, and hope is one way of doing this, to bring up some of the unhelpful answers to the challenges of coronavirus that can be heard in our culture. In fact, there are two very unhelpful answers that are out there that I think we can contrast the Christian message with as we ask questions. The first unhelpful answer, I guess I would describe as an unhelpful secular answer. And what do I mean by that? Well, the famous celebrity atheist Richard Dawkins once said this. He said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And it's interesting to ask, what would it look like if we applied Richard's ideas to coronavirus? If I'm talking to friends and they say, oh, I don't believe in God, I'll often weave, you know, someone like Richard in and say, hey, what do you think of this? Because if we took Richard's idea to their logical conclusion, you know, I guess we would be led to conclude that there's nothing wrong with the COVID-19 pandemic. Rather, coronavirus is simply doing its thing. Indeed, it's even harsher than that, given that the virus is largely eliminating the weak and the old and the sickly. In purely Darwinian terms, COVID-19 is potentially a good thing, as it's improving the strength of the herd. What a wonderful, glorious demonstration of evolution in action. But whenever I've sort of gently brought that into conversations and asked what people think about that idea, I always hear back, you know, that's incredibly bleak and stark. As a response to COVID-19, it entirely fails. Even the hardest-nosed atheist among my friends and networks would say, I think it's, you know, one thing to say the old have had their time. It's another when it's your beloved grandmother struggling on a ventilator. I noticed something else I think is interesting, and I love asking people about this one. Why is it that every country has largely rejected the secular answer? Our national responses have been to initiate lockdowns, to shut down the economy, to rack up a national debt of billions, all to save the weak and the infirm and the old. That is not a secular response in the slightest. But I said there were two unhelpful responses. There are unhelpful secular responses, and I love using questions to get people's engagement with that. But I also like saying to people, hey, have you noticed actually, there aren't just unhelpful secular responses, there are sadly some unhelpful religious responses. Some Christians, a few gung-ho Christians I found at times have been perhaps a little bit too quick to leap onto social media and proclaim that COVID-19 is divine judgment, that as a nation we deserve it. And not merely is that form of religious fundamentalism profoundly unhelpful, of course it's not remotely Christian. And rather that's the religious belief common in much of the East called karma. And that's the idea that you get what you deserve. There are unhelpful secular answers. There are also unhelpful religious answers. And I love to find ways to name those in conversations. And I'm encouraged that most people I talk to and ask about them see instantly they don't work. They reject them outright. They reject the secular ones. They reject the religious ones. And when that's been done, question I love to try and pivot to is, hey, have you ever thought about the fact there might be an alternative response to what we're going through? Maybe there's a third way, what we might call the Jesus way. I find if you do that in the right kind of way, the perfect response is when someone then says, well, what's the Jesus way? And I go, well, the answer to that is this. In Luke chapter 13, in the Gospels in the New Testament, there's a little discussion sparked when Jesus asked about some Galileans who had annoyed the Roman governor Pilate. And in response, Pilate was a bit of a tyrannical bully. He had these Galileans killed and mixed their blood with their sacrifices. And Jesus asked what he thinks. He's asked, had these Galileans done something wrong? Had they sinned in some way such that Pilate's actions were a judgment from God? And the reply that Jesus gives couldn't be clearer. Do you think those Galileans were worse sinners because they suffered this way? Absolutely not. I tell you, no. Jesus had no time at all for unhelpful religious answers and thoroughly rejects the idea that bad things only happen to bad people. But of course, he doesn't stop there. Jesus goes on in Luke 13 to point out that all of us will one day face judgment. And thus the bigger question becomes, why did these people, not why did these people experience such bad luck, so much as how will you stand up when your number is up? But Jesus doesn't merely raise that question. As I say, he loved to ask questions. He then tells another little story, one of his famous little parables, that opens up yet another question. He tells a story about a farmer, a servant, and a fig tree, and tells how the farmer had planted this fig tree in his vineyard, and he was getting very frustrated. He tried watering it and fertilizing it. He tried listening to the gardener's question time on the BBC World Service. No fruit was to be seen. And so the farmer says to his servant, chop it down. But the servant was a little bit kind of wiser and more savvy and more compassionate, and says to the farmer, well, leave it alone for 1 more year. I'll dig around it, fertilize it, and see if it bears fruit next year. You see, what intrigues me is as well as loving questions and teaching us how to use questions, Jesus also loves stories. And through this story, he explored a second question, really, that is hugely important and that COVID-19 raises, namely in a panic-stricken, pandemic-stricken society, how should we respond? Should we just cry with the religious fundamentalists, let judgment fall? Or should we just shrug with secularism and say it's just evolution doing its thing, let COVID-19 dance to its DNA? And I love finding ways to gently introduce into conversations the fact that, Jesus would reject both of those responses. He would say no to both those things, because through that parable, Jesus is saying, I think, even if the situation looks hopeless, Christians need to be people who respond with compassion and kindness and action and hope. What's the purpose of life according to Jesus? Well, to love God and love your neighbour, even if in purely Darwinian terms they're weak, old, or infirm. And so what I found helpful throughout these weeks of lockdown is to be looking for those opportunities as I talk to friends and talk to neighbours, of making the best opportunity, the best use of every conversation that comes my way, to ask good questions, to listen well, but also as I do that, and as you at home try this out, don't take that as an opportunity to try and show your own cleverness or any of those things, but just look for ways through questions and conversations to point to Jesus. And the way I've found so helpful over the years to do that, let me just share with you as I bring this part of the webinar to an end and hand back to Gareth. I find it really helpful to try and look for opportunities to say three things in a conversation. Can I find ways to say, what you just said there reminds me of something that Jesus said? Or what you've just said there reminds me of something that Jesus did? Or what you've just said there reminds me of a story that Jesus told? And I found that connecting the conversation through questions to the story of Jesus, and it can be profoundly helpful. Name the unhelpful secular answers, bring out the contrast between the gospel and atheism. Name the unhelpful secular answers. You win set religious answers. You can win friends if you have the confidence to say, look, I'm aware at times Christians are not always helpful in the things that we say, but then show people the better way, the Jesus way.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, guys. I love the way when you put your two contributions there together, it kind of forms a nice arc, because Gareth, you started with prayer, and Andy, you landed on talking about Jesus. And I think that kind of packages everything in really nicely, starting off talking to God about people, bringing in some of those techniques of conversation and listening, ruling out some of the bad answers. But the end point of the conversation that we want to get people to is Jesus himself. Now, we've talked about some of the territory that we're operating in. We've talked about some of our own fears and reluctances. You've then gone on and talked about some of these sort of practicalities. What about telling us then about some ways you've seen people doing this? What about some ideas of best practice, people that you've seen getting this right? Because I think it might be helpful for people watching to be able to maybe kind of imagine it more clearly with some stories or some ideas of people who are doing this well. And once they could picture that, maybe it will help people to make the move of imagination towards their own context and how they might work it out themselves. So could you maybe give us some examples of people who are doing this well?
I'll go first with that.
Cool.
Let me share a story from a few years back. I was so I've recently returned to Northern Ireland from Oxford. I was doing a master's at the university there, and while I was there, a friend contacted me and asked me if I would connect with a particular student from Sweden who was coming to do a PhD, and he'd been in conversation with my friend in North America, but now he was in Oxford, and he had some sort of big questions about faith and wanted to explore them with someone. And so I agreed to meet with this individual. I had no idea who he was. I had no idea how open or antagonistic he was. And obviously I was nervous. Clearly this guy was a clever individual. I fully assumed that he'd worked through a lot of questions before he'd even got to Oxford. So I met him for lunch in a cafe in Oxford, and initially there was a lot of small talk, and I had to work hard at keeping the conversation going because we'd never met. He was doing a PhD on water management in rural China, so not something that I'm particularly well versed in. It wasn't the weather or football, but I just kept asking questions, as Andy said, initially just about him and about his experience. And eventually we got around to some of his questions about God, and we explored those and did some of the similar techniques that Andy's just encouraged us in. And we began to meet over the course of a few weeks, just over lunch. And he began, as the trust developed, to share a little bit more about his own experience of family, and also share about just some difficulties he was having with his supervisor. And I just began to realize that beyond this guy's big questions, this was an individual who was incredibly lonely. And that's not uncommon, obviously, for postgraduate students. People are more than the sum of their intellectual questions. And so I invited him to our house for dinner with my wife, and we brought a friend, and we just showed him hospitality and got to know him. The topic of faith came up a few times over the night. And as that relationship began to develop, I began to see, this guy really needs a community, and he needs to see the Christian community in action. And so we have, Amy and I, my wife, have been running a small sort of missional community group in Oxford for some students at the time. And we just decided to invite him along and see what happens. And he came along. He knew we were very upfront with him about the kinds of things that we were doing. But as we began to sort of go on that journey with him, we began to become more regular on those sort of midweek community nights. He actually got connected with another friend of ours who was also studying and was a Christian. And in some ways, that's the last time I saw of him for about 6 months, because my friend and his wife took him under their wing. They began to go and chat to him, have dinner with him. Eventually, they invited him to an Alpha course and said, look, we'll come. If you're interested, we'll come. They came in an Alpha course, and just last year, actually, Amy and I were in a church in Oxford as he stood up in front of everyone, confessed his faith, and was baptized, and he's going on with the Lord. Now, I just share that story. Obviously, that's a story of huge success, but the reason why I share it is simply to make 2 points. One is that as intimidated as I was at the beginning, here's a DPhil student who's going to tie me in knots intellectually. People are more than the sum of their intellectual questions. And often we're so intimidated by somebody's sort of intellectual resume, or a perception that we might have of them of being way too advanced for us. But often the issues aren't intellectual issues at all. Sometimes they're existential issues. Sometimes there are issues of loneliness, and it's just not so much that people have huge questions about faith, simply that they've never seen it in action. And the other reason why I share it is just to simply show the amount of people and dimensions that were involved in this individual coming to faith. It's not all on us. We were simply the starting point for his journey in Oxford, and we connected him with some other people, and very organically the Lord moved him on to other people. And so we don't know sort of what stage we're at in a person's journey towards coming to faith. It may be the beginning, it may be at some point in the mid, or we may get that opportunity of actually leading them in a prayer of commitment. And yet, if we don't play our part, we might miss out on something very, very special. A friend of mine used to say to me, there are two big myths when it comes to evangelism. One is that it doesn't work. And I find, here's a male from Scandinavia, not known for its sort of Christian commitment in recent years, studying at one of the best universities in the world. So in terms of, his personal profile, this is the kind of individual that most people would say, this is impossible for somebody like that to come to faith. Mm-hmm. And yet he did. It does work. And the second thing that she said is that the other myth is that people aren't interested. And they'll never be interested, maybe, if we don't sort of step up and at least engage them. And we don't know whether they'll be interested on day one, or whether they'll start to show interest on day 30 or day 90 or 2 years down the line. But we have to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got a really good opportunity to do that. So that was just a story that really encouraged us. And as I say, he's going on with the Lord. So it works.
Mm-hmm. Great. Andy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Gareth. And one thing, actually, just to pick up on something you just said that I think is so helpful for people to remember, is I remember being sort of taught years ago when I was sort of quite younger and more inexperienced in evangelism, was, if you think of a scale from sort of 0 to 10, and 0 is somebody who's a complete non-Christian, as far away as you could possibly imagine, and 10 is someone who's just put their faith in Christ. When we're talking to our friends and our neighbours and our colleagues, are you just praying, Lord, how can I move this person even slightly along, even from 1 to 1.2, and then maybe another Christian will be used by the Lord to bring them further and further and further. And that takes the pressure off, because I think sometimes we can feel that unless we bring them the whole darn way, we're somehow failures. And to go, so many people, I think, have that kind of story that Gareth shared there. The couple of stories I wanted to share actually is, I think, particularly in relation to the kind of lockdown context. One is a personal story, and one's a story of something that a friend did that hugely interested me. In terms of the friend, just before lockdown happened, I was teaching an online course in evangelism, actually, for a Christian college in Canada. And one of the assessments that we set was for people to go out and interview somebody from a different faith. Firstly, because it got the students listening. And also, it's a really good evangelistic opportunity, because you go to a friend or a colleague and you can say, hey, can I talk to you about what you believe, if they're perhaps a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, or what you don't believe, they're an atheist. And this is for a college assignment. And that immediately gives you like a free pass. And you just ask lots of questions. And one particular student was so taken with this that then, as we went into coronavirus, has been using this as their evangelism technique, kind of, touching base with friends and then saying, hey, I just realized, it was, it took coronavirus to make me realize I haven't been so faithful in staying in touch. I'd love to do that. And by the way, I've never asked you about some of this stuff, and just asking questions about what they believe. And she said the opportunities that's created, it works over Zoom. It's no pressure, because she says, I don't preach. I wait for them to ask me. They invariably do. Then say, so what do you believe? But I found out so much about what makes my friends tick. It's not too tough. My heart rate is still going, but huge opportunities there. And I love that as a kind of Zoom-based lockdown evangelism technique, just reaching out to people and having those conversations. And then something we did personally here that, I'm trusting and praying is going to pay off. And my wife Astrid takes the credit for this. So I don't want you listening at home going, wow, that's just, Andy's just amazing that he thought of that. This is totally my wife's idea. Was that a few weekends ago, of course, it was Easter. And, we sort of prayed and thought about what we could do. And so we hit upon the idea of buying some Easter eggs and putting them, a bunch of them in little gift bags, along with a card that our kids had drawn and a copy of a wonderful little book by my friend John Lennox, who's a very gifted evangelist and also, sort of scientist and brilliant planet brain based at Oxford, called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And we put one copy of that book in each bag. And on Easter Sunday morning, we went door to door, knocked on neighbours' doors of families we already knew, stood back and said, hello, this is the socially distanced Easter chocolate delivery. And the conversations right away, because people were so happy to have people actually come and say hi and do it safely. Conversations have now begun off that, and there's a lot of seed saying that we know we're going to follow up when we can meet in person. And actually what that triggered, it's been funny the way the Lord works, that sort of seemed to be the trigger in our community for now. There's a whole set of sort of families who go door to door each week delivering baked goods, and the kids delivering things. And, I've begun to realize that we may as Christians have forgotten the power of hospitality in evangelism as well. And just those natural conversations now about why we did that and the book and so forth at the beginning. So we found that a really natural way of just leveraging our networks here locally already. So at home, just, those of you watching on the live stream, just maybe be praying, what are connections I've already got? How can I perhaps step forward with generosity, with kindness, with hospitality, even within the limits of lockdown?
Yeah. That's great. Thanks, guys, for that. We've covered a huge amount of ground in a very short amount of time. What we often do when we're not under lockdown at Solas is we do Confident Christianity conferences in different places around the country. And we explore these ideas over the course of a whole day. And when we're doing that, you really get a chance to kind of chew over the ideas. If some of the stuff you've heard this evening has kind of gone past at 150 miles an hour, you can catch up on all these streams. You can watch them again later and pull out some of the quotes on some of Andy's slides and some of those other things. You can watch it again, because I do appreciate that some of the ideas that we've moved through, we've been going at quite a rate. And we started off looking at the kind of the territory that we're in culturally at the moment, with both challenges and opportunities. We thought about some of our own reluctance to step up and share Jesus. We then looked at some of the practical ways we could move forward. And then we've told a few stories about people who have done this for real. So that kind of brings that part of our webinar to conclusion. Now, in a minute, we're going to move over to the Q&A, because you've been sending in some really, really great questions. I've just nipped across to the Pigeonhole website. Actually, Andy, could you stick that up again? There's some really helpful questions have been coming into Pigeonhole. If you would like to have a go and send in a few questions, you've still got a few more minutes to do that before I get Gareth and Andy to start going through some of those questions. There are probably 3 or 4 minutes where you can nip across there and put in any questions you have about any aspect of what we've been discussing and talking about this evening. Now, while I go and sift through those questions, I'm going to bring Andy back on now, because I've got a couple of questions for Andy. Andy, I'd like you to just introduce a little bit about Solas. I'm going to go across and sift through all the Q&A now. And while I do that, could you just tell everybody, just for a few minutes, who is organizing this webinar tonight? What is that badge up in the corner of your screen that says Solas? Who are you and what do you do? Could you just give us a few minutes on that while I sort out the Q&A?
I absolutely could, Gavin. That'd be a real kind of pleasure. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Solas, Solas is the Gaelic word, the Scottish word that means kind of light, sunlight. And we love the image of the kind of sort of light of the message of Jesus kind of spreading out across the nations. And we're based in Scotland, but also now based in Northern Ireland with Gareth on the team. And we're passionate about two things at Solas. We're passionate, first of all, about communicating the message of Jesus in a way that engages people's tough questions, listens genuinely, really tries to engage where people are, and shows how I believe that Jesus and the gospel have the deepest answers to life's toughest questions. And when lockdown isn't happening, we do that in places like coffee shops and pubs and restaurants. We go into universities and business settings. Right now, of course, lockdown is happening. So we're doing that online. A couple of ways we're doing that, actually. Next week's webinar, if you go to the Solas Facebook page or the Solas website, you can see that on the screen share there. You can go click on our webinars page and find what's coming up. Next week, we actually have what we call an open forum that Gareth and I, with Gavin's help, we're going to take a tough question. We're going to look at where is God with everything that's going on in coronavirus. People are asking that question so much. Where is God? Did God cause this? If God is good, why is there suffering? We're going to look at that question in detail next week. And for those of you watching who are Christians, that is a perfect webinar to invite a friend to. Start a watch party on Facebook. If you don't know how to do that, you just bring up the live stream on Facebook, click the share button and click watch party. You can invite your friends. And so very much just something you can bring non-Christian friends to. And the other thing we do as well that works particularly well in this lockdown age, we have a resource that we've been building for the past kind of 2 or 3 years called Short Answers. And these are videos where we take a tough question about the Christian faith and explore it in sort of 2 to 3, sometimes 4 minutes long. And again, you can find those on our Facebook page. You can find those on the Solas website. And I've done a lot of them. My former friend and colleague David Robertson has done many, and then Gareth is up there as well, and will be up there more in the weeks ahead. And we've been so encouraged to see about 1.2 million views or downloads on those videos as people have shared them with friends, used them in conversations. They're great to have, on your phone in your back pocket. You're talking to a friend, they ask a question you can't answer. You can say, hey, have you got a moment? I think I've got a video that just addresses that. And so we love doing that. And then the other thing we do is we do teaching and training for Christians. So again, when we're not in lockdown, myself and Gareth crisscross the country, partnering with churches, doing events for university groups, and putting on our famous Confident Christianity conferences, where we help take a whole day and help equip Christians in the local church, perhaps, to really learn how to be more confident, more natural in sharing your faith with your friends. So, check those out on the Solas website, and maybe reach out to us if you're a church leader watching this. We're planning for a post-coronavirus world, which we will one day get to, and we'd love to come and do that for you. And in the meantime, we do these kind of webinars. So those are just some of the things we love to do at Solas.
Excellent, Andy. And when you described David Robertson as your former friend and colleague, I'm hoping you meant former colleague and friend, so we can edit that.
Oh yes,
marvelous.
That's great. I wouldn't be at all surprised, given the time zone differences, as David is watching from Australia. If you are, that was
excellent. So, if people want to support the work that Solas is doing in evangelism and evangelism training, because we're involved on campuses, on missions, sharing the gospel when we're not under lockdown with non-Christian people week in, week out, in coffee shops and restaurants all over the place. We're training churches in evangelism as well. If folks want to get involved with that, maybe get us to come to their church when lockdown is over, or support us in other ways, what can people do? Where can they go to get involved with that?
Well, that's another great question, Gavin. People who watch us will notice that we have a tendency, both Gareth and I, to respond with "That's a good question," and because there's no such thing as a bad question. There are 2 ways that people can get involved, or 3 ways actually you can get involved with us at Solas. For those of you who are watching who are Christians, we'd love you to pray for us. It makes a massive difference. We are so conscious that when we go into some of the really tough settings, universities and business settings and pubs and so forth, the questions can be very tough and honest, and we don't want to be trying to do that under our own power. And so your prayers make all the difference. So please do pray for us. Now, of course, you may be thinking, I'd love to pray for you guys. Happy to do that. What can I pray? Well, that leads me to the slide I'm currently showing on the live stream here. What you can do, if you go to the Solas website, solas-cpc.org, that's our full name, Solas Centre for Public Christianity. And you'll see popped up on the bottom of every page on the Solas website, you'll see two little buttons, donate and newsletter sign up. If you click newsletter sign up, and just give us your email address, we'll do two things. Firstly, we'll take your email, and of course, we'll sell it to Google, make lots of money. No, seriously, just joking, just joking. Comedy doesn't work so well on our live streams, so my colleagues might say it doesn't work in person anyway. No, very seriously, what we'll do, we'll add you to the Solas email list. We will not give that email address to anybody. But what we will do is once a month, we will send you an email newsletter jam-packed with news on what we're up to, loads of free resources, so all the latest short answer videos and podcasts and goodness knows the amount of stuff that's jammed into our newsletters, and also news of the up and coming webinars. And the other thing we'll do is also if there are special events coming up like this webinar, we'll let you know. You can obviously unsubscribe at any time, and but yeah, do sign up for our newsletter. It makes it super easy for us to stay in touch with you. But then, as well as praying and staying in touch with what we're doing, the other thing we'd really ask the Christians watching this, if you're not a Christian this evening, if you're a skeptic or a seeker, you just come to find out what's going on here, this really doesn't apply to you. Everything we want to do is our gift to you. But for Christians watching this, what makes the work of Solas possible? We are a small organization. We don't have massive grant funds and things that make all of this possible. We rely on our network of friends and supporters across the country, around the world. Maybe many of you who are watching tonight are supporters of us. Thank you so much if you are. But if you're not, maybe you'd consider going to the Solas website and click the donate button there. And what we ask people to do is to sign up to supporters for as little as £3 a month. That's the price of a coffee at some of the more expensive coffee chains if they're currently open. And for £3 a month, you make a massive difference to our work. And as a thank you, we will actually send you a gift of a book. That book there you can see on the screen is my book, The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. That a lot of people have found very helpful. But actually on the Solas website right now, there's about 4 or 5 different books that you can choose. So you have a look, see what there is, and pick the one you like, and we will send that to you as a thank you. So your support makes all the difference. We cannot do this work without this great network of people up and down the country. And one of the things I love, actually, as I travel around the country when we are free to travel, is meeting friends and supporters around the country who that £3 a month makes them feel they're part of what we do. We want Solas to feel like a big community, not some sort of distant, disconnected organization. So we'd love for you to pray for us, join our mailing list, and if you can, get on board £3 a month.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Andy. And I'd probably add to that, we can't wait to get back out on the road and actually meet people, because one of the great things about the work that we do at Solas is we meet so many people and work with churches all around the country. And it's just going to be great when some unlocking goes ahead and we can kind of get on with some of that. Now,
and when we can all get decent haircuts.
Well, marvelous. Now, thank you so much to everybody that sent questions in. There's been some really good questions come in, some quite probing ones, some quite thoughtful ones. And if those of you who've been across in our little pigeonhole, you'll see that you can vote on the questions. And so some of them have been kind of voted to the top, which means that more people are kind of wanting that question asked. So we'll probably kind of start near the top and work through some of them. What I'm going to do is I'll send a question. I'll say who it's going to Gareth or Andy. And then if Andy, if you want to add something onto Gareth's answer, and likewise, otherwise we'll just do one question each, because there are probably more questions come in than we can, so we can't do all of them, because people have been really enthusiastic in sending their questions in. So what we'll do is say, first of all, thank you if you sent a question in. We'll try our best to get to your question. There are, as I say, more than we can get through in the next 25 minutes or so. So we'll do our best to get through, starting with the ones that have got the most votes and therefore people are thinking are the highest priority. So Andy, can I start off with you then, with this question that's coming from James, which has got quite a lot of votes. James has written, one of my friends wouldn't describe herself as an atheist. She just thinks that faith is irrelevant to life in the real world, in quotes. What's the way forward? She just looks bored when I raise it. Andy, what's the answer? How do we help James with that very real situation?
Yeah, well, thank you, James, for that, and for all those who upvoted your question there. It's a brilliant question, and it's brilliant for this reason, because I think there are two types of person out there. You meet people who have a definite objection to the Christian faith. There is some particular issue that is a stumbling block for them, and then in which case we want to ask questions around that, explore it, and help address it for them. But then there are others, like James, like your friend, who don't have any objections. And I often hear people say to me things like, I wish my friends were angry atheists like Richard Dawkins, because at least I could engage with that. But my friends, is like nailing Scotch mist to the wall. I'd say a couple of things can be helpful. This is where I think question asking can come in. And there's two ways I found it helpful, James, with friends like yours. If the person is sort of self-describing as an atheist, if that's a word they use for themselves, sometimes I kind of find it helpful to be a little bit cheeky. And with a twinkle in your eye, the twinkle can be quite key to this, is to say, it's interesting, atheist tells me what you don't believe, but it doesn't tell me what you do believe. I don't believe in the tooth fairy, but if I just describe myself as an a-tooth-fairy, wouldn't tell you a lot. So what do you believe? Tell me what you think the real world is like. Tell me what you think really, really matters. What is life all about? And begin drawing the questions out of your friend. And as you do, look for the places where you can be the one who's asking the questions now. They say, well, I think life is all about, making other people happy and being kind to others. So, well, why is that? Why do you think that's the case? And so sort of turn the tables slightly. And then the other thing I think you can do, and I think coronavirus helps a bit with this, and I touched on this earlier, is I think look for places where the way your friend is living point to something bigger. There's a very famous Canadian kind of philosopher called Charles Taylor, who wrote a big fat book on atheism and secularism. And he talked about the fact that although we live in this secular age, a very atheistic age in some ways, he described these kind of signs of transcendence that are everywhere. People believe in justice, they believe in beauty, they believe in meaning. I expect your friend, while she may say she's not interested in God, doesn't think that it's okay to wallop people over the head. She probably believes in things like human rights and dignity and justice, probably. And what you can do, I think, is when you see that manifested in something she said or the way she's living, ask that question. Say, hey, just out of interest, I noticed that you were out clapping for the NHS the other night. That was great. Why did you do that? Why did you think it was important to celebrate, our health workers? And just gently tug on the thread slightly, and then find the opportunity to say, I really don't think that, with the very greatest respect, that atheism offers a foundation for the things that you care about. It seems to me that all the things that you care most about actually really fit best with Christianity. So you say that you don't think God is relevant, but I think he's profoundly relevant, because all the things that you seem to really care the most about seem to have their foundation in God. Now, of course, she may come back, your friend may come back, I don't agree with you. Great. Now you've got a discussion going, and you can say, tell me more. Why do you think that?
Yeah, excellent. Gareth, do you want to add anything to that, or can we move on to the next question to try and steam through them?
Only to say that good on you for having sort of non-Christian friends. I think one of the biggest challenges for Christians today is actually having someone who in their life who's not a Christian. I was talking to someone, a pastor, about this today. As in, many people in his congregation don't even have non-Christians that they're in relationship with. So it seems like a very basic starting point, but if you don't really know, or you're not engaged deeply in the lives of non-Christians, it's going to be very hard to talk to them about anything. So and then just try and find those points of connection. They're whether they're ambivalent about God and faith and things like that, they're certainly not ambivalent about other things, and particularly often ethical things and meaning. So just try and engage on that level. We have to learn to be a little bit bilingual. And why, for us, often Christianity is the most important thing. It's a deeply meaningful thing. But for our non-Christian friends, it's just our weird hobby. And it doesn't mean anything to them. But they have their own weird hobby that doesn't mean as much to us, but is deeply meaningful to them. It could be activism or veganism or climate change or something like that. Why should they be interested in our weird hobby if we're not prepared to do those steps of showing interest and being able to converse about the things that they are passionate about, and maybe that will open doors to them sort of reciprocating about it.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. Now, next question is really interesting. Gavin McF. I knew a Gavin McF. I wonder if it's the one I know. Anyway, his question is great. He says, how can the online church be more evangelistic or missional in the way it does things? And, you know, picking up on some of the things you've talked about earlier on about the kind of the spiritual interest and the questions, maybe the Russell Brand conversation earlier on, how can the online church be more evangelistic? Andy, do you want to take that one to start with?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Do you want to take the camera as well, so it's focused on you while you're speaking there?
Oh, yeah, look at that. There we go. Yeah, so let me say a couple of things just about this, and then I'll pass the baton to Gareth. I think one of the ways I think could be really, really helpful is in online churches. It can be possible, and I'm stressing can be, because every church is different, and some churches are doing amazing stuff, and other churches are kind of struggling. So the last thing I want to doing is, you know, be heard to be saying, "Hey, you're doing it wrong. Do it this way." But I think the first thing is I think churches can make the effort to be encouraging their people to be more missional. You know, just like Gareth and I have shared some stories this evening, things we've tried. You know, why not, if you're not already, and if you're a pastor watching this, what about, you know, perhaps part of your service, getting people in your congregation who've got some stories to share them, give some examples of good practice. Would be a good way of doing it. So you're drip feeding into the conversation ways to do it, and point people to good resources as part of your online services. I mean, obviously there's the Solas short answers, but there's lots of other great organizations, Alpha, Christianity Explored, who do things. Be pointing your church members, I think, to things they can use with their friends. Secondly, I think, you know, to be weaving examples into your sermons for those of you who are pastors and preachers, encouraging people to take this content out there. You know, when I preach, I'm always trying to find ways to be saying to the congregation, you know, when you're talking to your friends, this is how you might use this issue. So you're seeding that into there. And then lastly, the other idea I'd throw out is going, you know, rather than fill the entire wall-to-wall spectrum that your church is doing with, you know, 2 services on a Sunday, a prayer meeting, multiple Bible studies and things, those are all great. Don't get me wrong, they're hugely important. What about realizing, you know, in this online age, it's so easy to invite people. So why not put a little open forum on? You know, we do this at Solas, but you can do this too. We're happy to help you do that, but you can maybe do it on your own. Why not host an Ask the Pastor Anything evening and tell the congregation, hey, invite your friends. Pastor, we'll be online for half an hour. We'll take Q&A just like we've done it. And, you know, the first time as a pastor, it can be scary, but it makes you very, very accessible. And I think so that in a sense, that's actually easier to do now when people might find it a little bit nerve-wracking. And then lastly, I said 3, but one last one. As a pastor or a leader, when you're preaching to your Zoom congregation, if you're not already, always remember there may be non-Christians present. You know, preach like there may always be a non-Christian watching, because people are, as that Guardian article showed us, dropping in on stuff. So just be careful the language we use, the way we phrase things. Always be preaching as if there are non-Christians present, because by God's grace, there may be.
Okay, Gareth, do you want to add anything to that before we move on to the next one?
Only to say that we're doing a webinar in a couple of weeks that's precisely on this issue. So tune in for that. Great.
Thank you. Gareth, can we stay with you? A question here is probably picking up on something that you said earlier on. You talked about good conversations and the importance. Ryan has picked up on that in his question. Sorry, Mark from Aberdeen, rather. And he says, can you offer some advice on how we can effectively and naturally segue from conversations with our friends about coronavirus and lockdown and anxiety and onto the gospel? So how do we move the conversation forward into gospel territory?
Yeah, well, I think Andy's mentioned a little bit of that already, just in terms of picking a theme that is a commonality. So I think part of this is, part of the challenge with this is as a culture, again, not specific to the religious conversation, but as a culture, we're just naturally more averse to discuss things that may open up areas of disagreement. I mean, I read about a professor who did a social psychology study a few years ago. I think it was out of the University of Lancaster, and he was sharing that actually, as a society, we're more open about things that we never used to be open about. So we're more open to talking about, you know, our private lives, sexuality, and things like that. But the one thing that we're not open about anymore is how we voted on Brexit, or those areas that we know are naturally contentious. And so as a society, we've all but retreated. And I think just practically, as I said, with those kinds of steps, it's going to be a big jump to go from sort of small talk to the God conversation. But if you can be invested in someone and go along that journey of moving more from sort of football and the weather to more about how they're getting on with their studies, or what's work like, what's the relationship with the boss like, how are things with the kids at the minute, and try to make those slightly deeper, more open conversations more natural. And that will require you to be more vulnerable and open yourself. Then I think they naturally lend themselves more towards moving then towards the aspect of our lives that is more meaningful, which is the gospel. So I mean, a lot of this, and this is why again I think prayer is so fundamental. A lot of it is about discernment. A lot of it is about the leading of the Holy Spirit. A lot of it is just having the boldness to at least attempt, either make an invitation to an event online, as Andy says, or just raise the conversation about hope. Again, find that area of commonality. And the other thing that I would say is, if it bombs and you get a real knockback, don't be discouraged. Don't give up, and don't never go to the conversation again. But just maybe go back and just think through, okay, how do I do this in a better way next time? What was the issue there? How do I, not give the impression that the only things I want to talk about, or the basis of this relationship, is all about how quickly I can get this person to confess Christ. So some of us do that more naturally through our personality. Some of us are more conversant in terms of just our natural demeanor. But the big thing is that the art of good conversation and discernment about how to move it is not a spiritual gift. It's not something that some people have and other people don't have. It's a dynamic thing. It can be learned, often by trial and error, but don't give up.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. Okay, next question that's kind of been voted up to near the top of our list really draws us into the whole area of good personism. We kind of know what to say when someone comes to us, and their kind of opening gambit is, how can I be forgiven? My sins are so overwhelming. That leads naturally to Jesus. But what do we do when we're sharing the gospel with someone who deeply believes that they are good and therefore sees no need? So Ryan phrases his question very personally like this. He says, how do I share my faith with my mum, who says she is a good person because she does good things? Andy, do you want to start us off on this one? Because I know that you've thought about that and good personism quite extensively. So could you take us into some ways we can helpfully share Christ with people who genuinely believe that they're good and they don't sense their need for him?
Yeah, I mean, let me say, just again, a couple of things, and then tag team with Gareth, because I think sometimes it's good to get the different perspectives on this. I love firstly the way you described it, Gavin. I don't know if that was you or if it was the gentleman who asked the question. The good personism idea that one of my old friends sort of likes to say that good personism is actually the biggest religion on the planet. The biggest religion on the planet is not Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. It's good personism. This idea that I'm basically a decent person. I think, sticking with the theme of questions, I think, obviously, rather than push straight back, particularly if it's close family like your mum, and go, no, you're not, you're a swine, probably is not the way to win friends and persuade people. But questions are. So I think a couple of questions I found helpful around the whole good person thing. Firstly is to say, just out of interest, how does, by what criteria do you think you're a good person? Analogy I've sometimes found helpful is to say that, if I describe myself as a world champion archer and I shoot an arrow at a barn door from 50 yards away, walk up to the barn door and draw the bullseye around it afterwards, that does not make me a world-class archer, because I'm the one who set the criteria. And if by good person you simply mean, well, this is what I think good is and I'm going to do it, most human beings think they're good people, even people who are fairly monstrous. There have been some sort of tyrants and monsters down through history who probably, if you'd taken a Stalin or whoever and said, you're living a fairly decent life, would have gone, well, actually I am, thank you very much. So that's the first problem. Second thing is to try and be, the other way you can ask a question here is to ask the person, so who do you consider to be a bad person? Because what you're trying to tease at here is we have this tendency as human beings to divide the world into good people and bad people. And when we do that, we always naturally put ourselves in the good box. I always find it interesting that most people, sometimes there are others who know that they have issues, but most times when people think there are good people and bad people involved, they always put themselves into the good box and look down on others. And my slight concern with that is we live in such a divided world right now. We live in a world where people are so quick to divide like that and look down on others. Just look at social media on a typical day, where people pile on and insult others and consider themselves above the rest of the herd. Yes. And the danger is, once you're simply saying, well, I'm a good person because of this, the implication is I'm better than somebody else. And here's where I like to bridge and say, look, this whole conversation reminds me of something Jesus said. Because there's a very famous story in the Gospels of Jesus and the rich young ruler, it's known as. And many Christians listening will probably know that story of the young man who comes to Jesus and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And the implication there is, well, clearly you look like a good person, and so you must know the way. And Jesus turns around to him and says, why do you call me good? Only God is good. This from Jesus, who was God himself with us. And Jesus in that dialogue cuts out from underneath this guy the idea that actually being good is good enough, because the only standard of goodness that counts is to be as good as God, and we are all in trouble. And one of the things I find so liberating about the gospel, and if you can bring this into the conversation, is look, God isn't playing some kind of zero-sum game where it's like he's got a score, and if you get it, you're a good person. If you don't, you're a bad person. That way lies tremendous pressure, lies the tendency to look down on others. Rather, the radical message of the gospel is we are all in trouble. It's the great leveler. None of us, not your mum, not your lovely old granny, not Mother Teresa, has the ability to go, hey, I'm a good person, I'm okay. Because the Bible says we're not. We actually all need Jesus, because we all fall short, some by a long way, some by a short way, but we still fall short. And that's why the message of Jesus is so important, because it takes our pride down a peg or two and gets the real issue, which is our self-centeredness and our sense of self-righteousness that lies sometimes behind the question. But Gareth, do you want to add anything to that? I've got to set that up. Did you want to take that anywhere different?
No, I mean, I think you've covered it. Only to say that I used to struggle with this sense that I was particularly good myself, and then I got married, and that shattered that.
Excellent. Very good. Okay, Gareth, could we stay with you on the screen there then for the next question? The next question that's been voted up near the top is kind of a practical one. And Sarah is asking about all these people who are kind of coming into the online services who don't normally attend church, and how, as the church, we can continue to serve them when lockdown ends and we go back to our buildings. And she says, how can we help them make the transition to attending in person once lockdown is over? So any thoughts on that practically for folks that are really encouraged at the moment that their viewing figures are going up and up online every Sunday morning, and there's all these folks maybe asking questions involved? What do we do for them when we are unlocked?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. Thank you for it. I was interestingly, I was talking to a local pastor of a big church here in Northern Ireland about this precise issue, because he's very encouraged that their Sunday morning online services, that the numbers have just gone through the roof. And he knows that there are people who would never sort of come through the door of the church, but are now engaging via social media and things like that. And in some ways, for all the challenges and the difficulties that there is with coronavirus, I think the situation of lockdown, it could actually be very contingent towards and very helpful for the gospel in some ways, because our natural way of doing things, often with our methods of evangelism as past, has been evangelism happens in the church. Let's do an event in the church. Let's get someone along to do a big event in a public space. And of course, we're very much part of that at Solas, so we're not against it. But that's the one thing we can't do. And in fact, in terms of the trajectory of opening up lockdown, that's probably the last stage that we'll be able to get to. So one of the things that I was encouraging this pastor to do was to say, look, I think it would be helpful for Christians to acknowledge that these people are are checking in and viewing, maybe not all of it, but they're certainly exploring, and that's a great thing. And maybe even just say that as part of your service. You know, a lot of people are doing so because they enjoy the anonymity. There's no commitment. They don't need to mix with any people. They're in the comfort of their own home. They can turn off if they don't like it. It's very contingent towards what people enjoy, and sort of not having to commit too heavily themselves at this stage. But our hope is that they'll hear enough of the gospel to be intrigued and go on a journey. And our goal really has to be that when lockdown is completely over and we do meet again, we want to see people who've connected in with us online actually joining. But as there's a sequence, almost a stage stepping towards opening up, I think that can also be the journey that we take people who are curiously sort of dipping into services on. It may well be that the next stage, once churches aren't allowed, or once churches move from purely online services, there might be small events or small groups that can get together. And I think we should just take opportunity to invite people who we maybe don't know, and they're maybe happy to be anonymous, but invite them to that. Maybe one of the things that our church over here does is always give the opportunity for people to follow up what they've heard or ask questions via emails and via telephone and things like that. And the more that we can just open little windows or open little doors as we walk towards finally being able to be together again on a Sunday as a big group, I think we should remember that in all of those stages, we want to be considering those who have questions, those who wouldn't consider themselves Christians at this stage, and think about what does this look like for them? What can we create for them? Now, I'm not a pastor, so I don't have a hard and fast formula or answer for what that looks like at every stage. But my encouragement to churches and to leaders would certainly be to consider it and to be thinking about it, not just in terms of what this means for your individual regular congregation, but what does it look for those who are just looking in and perhaps going on a journey. Let's have that expectation of people. Let's have that expectation of the gospel, and let's try and facilitate, contextualize and effective ways of allowing people to continue to join us as we move more from the purely digital to the in-person event again.
Okay, that's lovely. And if you want to comment on that quickly, we're kind of up against the clock, so we're going to have to go Solas short answers from now on to see if we can rattle through a few more of these folks' questions, because even while you're speaking, some of them are getting kind of voted up. So anything you want to add to that before we move on, Andy? Your microphone's off.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, Gavin, that that was a great answer. So why don't we move on?
Okay, we'll move on. Okay, can I stay with you then, Andy? Next question then is, this is from Anonymous, and it says, how do I deal with a humanist view of a friend of mine? He will say he doesn't believe in God, but he finds his values in other places. He believes in the good of humanity and doesn't need God for that. Short answer.
Very short answer. Well, we've done a short answer on that, actually. The question I would throw back, and again, you'll see the pattern here, folks, that I'm encouraging questions. Say to him, okay, you say that humanity is good. What about? And the simple answer is that actually, look through history. History is littered with some particularly bad examples of humanity. And in fact, even right now, use coronavirus to go, isn't it interesting? Two things have happened with coronavirus. There have been great acts of selflessness, people being generous and kind. Look at the amazing way that NHS staff and others who have served us have just gone the extra mile. But then what also happened as soon as coronavirus struck, people started hoarding toilet rolls, panic buying food. There was very much a I'm for myself mentality. And I think it doesn't take a lot to show that humanity is split. We have this split personality. Yes, we can be very, very generous and good, but we can also be selfish and mean, and all of us can. I love that line that Gareth used earlier about, getting married reveals to you what you really, really like. How do we deal with the fact that we have this kind of split nature within us? And I think I would gently be saying to my humanist friend, I think humanism has a tendency to go around with one eye shut. It likes to look at the good and go, oh yeah, humans do some good things. And we do, let's affirm that. But also, we can also be one messed up creature as well. And I think humanism struggles actually to explain real evil, real genuine evil. And it certainly doesn't offer any power to live differently. Again, say to your friend, what if you're a person who struggles to live well and to make a difference and be a good person? What hope is there? What hope is there for forgiveness? And what hope is there for power to live differently? The gospel offers those, humanism doesn't.
Excellent. Okay, next one then for Gareth. Again, we're going for a short answer here. And this is from Cherry. Cherry's fired a couple of questions into us. This one's for you, Gareth. And she says this: I have friends who happily agree with much, yet remain apparently indifferent. How are we to persuasively communicate a sense of urgency without making them look panicked when I talk about God next time? So a sense of urgency, I guess, without clobbering people. How are we going to do that, Gareth? Isn't that a great question too?
Go around with a big sign that says the end is nigh.
Oh yeah, that works.
It's a great question. I mean, I think the best answer that I could probably give off the top of my head at this stage is, again, to just, if you can, I mean, if they're already open to some of it and they're prepared to explore it, but it's just, I'll get round to it sort of idea. I would really try and press in on this idea of truth and whether truth matters. I think there's a danger with the sort of hell. Often the urgency does sort of come along the lines of kind of hellfire and brimstone stuff, and therefore, simply because becoming a Christian is my ticket to heaven and avoiding of hell, then I need to get it done as soon as that. Christianity obviously is much more than that. That's not untrue, of course. But I think in terms of whether truth really matters, and that question of, look, this affects all of my life, and it affects all of my life here and now. If you can begin to show that both in terms of your own life, that actually it's not just something that you can get round to, when you have to sort of face up to your own mortality or something like that, but it's something that enriches every part of life and meaning and purpose and how to live in the here and now. And I think if you can really do that, I can't see how that can't begin to have some sort of effect.
Okay, Andy, anything to add on to that one?
No, because the clock is against us.
Okay, one more I've got for you then, Andy, if we're really under pressure. This one is particularly for you. It's an anonymous question. And it says, I have two friends who are Muslims. Both are keen to have me pray for them in Jesus' name on the phone. How can I take it to the next stage without getting into religion comparison?
Wow.
And you've got a minute to answer.
Well, I may be slightly more than a minute, but I'll do my best. So
okay.
I always get very excited when Muslims show an openness to Jesus. Just a story. One of the most exciting sort of things on this for me in the last kind of 18 months to a couple of years or so. I was doing an event at Glasgow University a short while ago with a friend of mine. We did an open forum where we just had Q&A all night. It was about 90 minutes long, and we had about I don't know how many questions, question after question. But then at the end of the evening, a young man came up to talk to myself and my friend, and really interesting. He said to us, he introduced himself by saying, I'm a Muslim. He said, I've been investigating the claims of Christianity, very drawn to the claims of Jesus. I think those stack up. I have increasingly coming to the conclusion the Quran doesn't. He said, so would you pray for me? And we said, what? Do you want to pray for you to become a Christian? He went, no, I'm not quite there yet. He said, but would you pray that I have the courage to follow the evidence about Jesus where it leads? And I was hugely struck by his honesty to just take that look at Jesus. And I think for many Muslims, that's where it begins. I have so many former Muslim friends, now Christians, who first encountering Jesus, taking Jesus seriously, even having dreams of Jesus. So with your Muslim friend, I would say, first thing is, leap on the opportunity, thank them and say you'd love to pray for them. And yeah, don't begin by clobbering them. Don't begin by sneakily turning a prayer into a debate, like praying, against the things that they believe. Just be very open, pray for them, ask them how you can pray for them, ask them what's going on with their family, their job, their life. How can you do that? Just weave Jesus naturally into the conversation. Your Muslim friend will be very struck by the way that you pray, because Christian praying is very different from Muslim praying, which is usually quite formulaic and sort of set prayers that are prayed. You pray the daily prayers in Islam are prayed in Arabic, even if you're not an Arabic speaker. The kind of relational praying that we have through Jesus in Christianity is something quite unique. So that's the first thing. But then what I do is look for an opportunity to ask the next question. So once you've done that, maybe do this 2 or 3 times, just be gentle. Find the opportunity in your conversation with them to say, hey, do you know why it is that as Christians we pray to Jesus? Do you know why Christians do that? And then see how they respond. And the fact they've already asked you to do that and been open to that, there's a very good chance they may be open for you to share. And now you don't need to critique Islam. You don't need to criticize Muhammad or the Quran. I do that sometimes if I need to, but you don't have to. Just talk about why that is, why you believe Jesus is who he is, and why you believe the New Testament teaches Christians to pray in his name, and see where that conversation goes. I think there are usually 2 aspects of someone crossing the bridge from Islam to Christianity. Certainly there is the coming to doubt the Quran and Muhammad. That's usually in there. But usually far more powerful is being drawn to Jesus and being attracted by him and seeing something there they haven't seen in Islam. So I would say an incredible opportunity. Take it, do it gracefully, pray for them, and of course pray for them privately as well. And particularly, as we're coming to the end of this time of Ramadan, when Muslims are potentially more spiritually open, be praying that Jesus speaks to them. Thousands of Muslims have come to faith in Christ when Jesus has appeared to them in dreams. Pray that for your Muslim friend. And remember as you do that Jesus loves your Muslim friend even more than you do. And maybe you'll have the privilege of him using you to reach them.
That's wonderful. Thanks, guys. So just wrap up now with a couple of thank yous. Thank you to Andy and Gareth. We've made you work really hard tonight. Thank you to everybody who's joined us from all kind of different parts of the world. We're really grateful that you have tuned in and joined us tonight. It's been lovely having you with us. Thank you too for all those of you who've gone across to the Pigeonhole and sent your questions in. And sorry we didn't get through them all. There were many, many more than we could get through. And there were some brilliant ones and we just ran out of time. I'm so sorry for that. End with a couple of things. The first is please do come across to our website. Send in any comments about what went well tonight in our first ever webinar, what we got right, what we got wrong, what we can improve. We'd love to hear from you. Sign up for our newsletter so that we can tell you about the other things that we're doing. We'd love you to pray for us and all the other work of Solas. And just end with a thing that we started with. Although we've been talking tonight about the practicalities of Christian mission under lockdown, we are really aware that this is a hard time for many of you, and we would love to pray for you in our staff prayer meeting. If you go to the Solas website, go to connect with us and send in an email. If you're struggling with loneliness or financial difficulties or illness or bereavement because of the current crisis, we genuinely would love to spend some time praying for and supporting you, just like we pray and support each other in the Solas team. That's all for us tonight. Please will you come back and join us for our future webinars. This is our first go. There are 3 more scheduled. Come and join us for those. We hope you enjoyed this evening. Thank you and God bless.